What's up, everyone? Welcome back to the channel. Today I want to cover one of my favorite new magic items from Secrets of Magic, Spellhearts. But before we get into that, there is a couple things I need to talk about. First, if you want to support me, the best way to do it is on my Patreon page. Not only will it allow me to make some money doing this, but it will also give you access to some amazing perks, including access to my videos before anyone else. The link is down below, along with my Facebook and my Twitter page. And while you're down there, go ahead and hit that like and subscribe button. If you don't like my content, you can always unsubscribe and unlike. Secondly, before you can understand Spellhearts, you have to understand Talismans, because they work similarly. There are some key differences, but you use them in mostly the same way. A talisman is a consumable item that you can attach to your armor, weapon, or shield. You can only have one talisman attached to an item at a time. If you try to attach more than one, none of them work. In order to activate a talisman, you must be wearing or wielding the item that the talisman is attached to. You can only use a talisman once before it disappears. Usually, a talisman can only be attached to a certain type of item. For example, the Onyx Panther talisman can only be attached to your armor. You must spend 10 minutes attaching a talisman to an item using the Affix a Talisman activity. There are two major differences between Spellhearts and Talismans. You activate Spellhearts in much the same way that you activate Talismans, but they are permanent items. That's right, unlike Talismans, they stick around. Another difference is that Spellhearts give you a choice on what they're attached to. They give different effects depending on what they're attached to as well. If you have a Spellheart attached to an item, it also gives you access to certain spells depending on the Spellheart. When you cast a cantrip from a Spellheart, you can use your spell attack roll or spell DC, depending on the spell, instead of the ones that the Spellheart gives you. Also, you cannot affix a Spellheart and a Talisman to the same item. You get one or the other, not both. You can craft a Spellheart just like any other magic item, but you need the spells that the Spellheart in question can cast. Now, let's get to some examples. There are 5 Spellhearts in Secrets of Magic. The first one is the 5-Feather Wreath, which is all about air. Spell attack roll for any spell that is cast by the Spellheart is +8. The spell DC for this item is 18. If you put this Spellheart on your armor, then you gain a +1 item bonus to acrobatics checks and resistance 2 to falling damage. If you put it on your weapon, then after you cast a spell from the Wreath, you can fly 5 feet as a single action, or you can fly 10 feet as a free action if the spell you cast wasn't a cantrip. You must use this action immediately after casting the spell, and if you don't have a fly speed, you must end your flight on solid ground or fall. With this Spellheart, you can cast Gale Blast as a cantrip. It doesn't actually say this, but I'm thinking that this cantrip is probably heightened as normal for cantrips. Of course, each Spellheart also has a greater and major version. These allow you to cast the same cantrip as the original version, and have better versions of the other powers. Plus, these versions also give you access to other spells once per day. The greater version of the 5-Feathered Wreath gives you resistance 5 to falling damage when it is affixed to armor. Also, when it is affixed to a weapon, when you cast a non-cantrip spell from the Wreath, the fly speed is 25 feet. The spell attack roll of this Spellheart is +14, and the spell DC is 24. This Spellheart allows you to cast Wall of Wind once a day as well. When affixed to armor, the major version of this Spellheart gives you a +2 to acrobatics and resistance 10 to falling damage. When affixed to a weapon, the fly speed when casting a non-cantrip spell from it is 40 feet. The spell attack roll is +19 and the spell DC is 29. This Spellheart also allows you to cast 4th level Wall of Wind and Airwalk once per day each. The Flaming Star is of course all about fire. When casting a spell from the original version of this Spellheart, the spell attack roll is +7 and the spell DC is 17. When this Spellheart is affixed to armor, you gain resistance 2 to fire. When affixed to a weapon, after you cast a fire spell by activating it, your strikes with the weapon deal an additional 1d4 fire damage until the end of your next turn. The original version of this Spellheart also allows you to cast Produce Flame as a cantrip. The Greater Flaming Star gives you resistance 5 to fire whenever it is attached to armor. When affixed to a weapon, the extra fire damage is 1d6 instead of 1d4. The spell attack roll for this Spellheart is plus 14, and the spell DC is 24. This Spellheart also allows you to cast Fireball once a day. When affixed to armor, the Major Flaming Star gives you resistance 10 to fire. When affixed to a weapon, the extra fire damage is 1d8. The spell attack roll for this Spellheart is plus 19, and the spell DC is 29. With this Spellheart, you can also cast 4th level Fireball and Wall of Fire once per day each. The Grim Sandglass is an excellent Spellheart for Necromancers. The spell DC of any spells that are cast from the original version of the Sandglass is 17. When attached to armor, this Spellheart gives you resistance 2 to negative damage. When attached to your weapon, this Spellheart gives you 1d4 extra negative damage on your strikes until the end of your next turn after you cast a necromancy spell from this Spellheart. The low-level version of this Spellheart also allows you to cast the Chill Touch cantrip. The Greater Grim Sandals gives you resistance 5 to negative damage when affixed to armor. You gain an extra 1d6 negative damage on strikes after you cast a spell from this Spellheart. The greater version of this Spellheart also allows you to cast 2nd level Heal or Harm once per day. The spell DC for these spells is 24. The Major Grim Sandals item gives you resistance 10 to negative damage when affixed to armor. It also gives you 1d8 extra negative damage on strikes. With the major version of this Spellheart, you can also cast 4th level Heal or Harm, as well as Enervation or 4th level Restoration. The DC for these spells is 29. We've talked about the Fire Spellheart, now let's talk about the Water Spellheart. It is known as the Perfect Droplet. The spell DC of the original version is 17. When affixed to armor, you gain resistance 2 to water effects and attacks by water creatures. When affixed to a weapon, after you cast a water spell by activating the Droplet, your body becomes mist-like. Until the end of the turn, you can move through enemy spaces, but you treat each square in their space as difficult terrain. You cannot, however, move through creatures that have the water trait in this way. This Spellheart also allows you to cast the Spout cantrip. The Greater Perfect Droplet increases the resistance to 5 when affixed to armor. When the greater version of this Spellheart is affixed to a weapon, enemy spaces aren't treated as difficult terrain when you're mist-like. Also, this Spellheart allows you to cast Aqueous Orb or Feats of Fins once a day. The DC for these spells is 24. When the Major Perfect Droplet is affixed to an armor, the resistance increases to 10. When affixed to a weapon, this Spellheart has the same effect as the Greater Perfect Droplet. The major version of this Spellheart allows you to cast 4th level Aqueous Orb, Feat of Fins, or Hydraulic Torrent once a day. The DC for these spells is 29. So, we've got a Spellheart for fire, water, and air. Pretty sure you can guess what element the last Spellheart's going to be. Earth, obviously. The last Spellheart we got in Secrets of Magic is called the Trinity Geode. When you affix the Geode to armor, when you cast an Earth spell by activating the Geode, you gain resistance 1 to physical damage until the end of your next turn, or double that resistance for a non-cantrip spell. This does not apply against adamantine. When affixed to a weapon, if you cast an Earth spell by activating the Geode, your strikes with that weapon deal 1d4 additional bludgeoning damage until the end of your next turn. This Spellheart also allows you to cast Scatter Scree as a cantrip. The DC of this spell is 17. When the Greater Trinity Geode is affixed to armor, the resistance to physical damage increases to 3. If it's affixed to a weapon, the extra damage increases to 1d6. With this Spellheart, you can also cast Meld into Stone once per day, with a DC of 24. With the major Trinity Geode, resistance to physical damage when affixed to armor is 5. When affixed to a weapon, the extra damage is 1d8. You can also cast 4th level Meld into Stone and Spike Stones once per day each, with a DC of 29. And that's all the Spellhearts we have so far. I'm sure there'll definitely be more in the Grand Bazaar when that finally comes out. Overall, I'd say Spellhearts are pretty cool. Melee fighters can get a lot of use out of them. They can be used for offensive or defensive purposes depending on where you put them. It's also really cool that now melee fighters have access to elemental damage without putting a rune on their weapon. This means that if a melee fighter wanted to, he could have 4 different elements on a single sword, which is fantastic for taking advantage of enemy weaknesses. Also, if you put him on armor, you can now have resistance to quite a few elements. Between Rings of Energy Resistance, Ancestry Feats, and Spellhearts, that's a lot of energy resistance. But anyway, I'm going to wrap up the video here. Just remember, teamwork is vital, and I'll see you guys next time.